Hey everybody, this is Pastor Scott from Dallas Baptist Church, giving you a little bit of a devotional thought for today. We're going to look at Job here in a moment, talk a little bit about Job. I've talked about Job here recently in one of these little devotional videos about Job 121. But I want to talk about Job chapter 2. We find that Job loses his health, and his wife comes to him in verse 9, and I'm reading from the NRSV translation. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So again, Job has been put into a temptation type situation to curse God, to give up on God, to quit. In the first chapter, we find that his children, his property are all gone. Now his health is gone. Now his wife is given up on him and his God, and he doesn't quit. He just says, shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? Sometimes bad things happen. Life isn't always peachy and rosy. We have a lot around us who are going through a lot of life changes. Maybe we ourselves are going through life changes, and we experience grief. Life changes often trigger grief in us. It doesn't have to be that just somebody died or we've lost a loved one. We can experience the loss of identity that triggers grief. Job lost his identity. He was a rich, wealthy individual. He lost his property. He lost his identity as a father when he lost his children. He lost his identity as a healthy individual when he lost his health. He lost his identity as a husband when his wife gave up on him and his God. He lost a lot of us lose our routine. I'm a big routine person, and this pandemic has really messed up my routine. I can only imagine what Job type of routine he had. Get up in the morning, care for the animals, or have your slaves care for the animals, and then anyway, his routine was out of whack. And my routine has especially been out of whack with my kids not being in physical school but doing virtual school. It's been crazy. And I haven't got a lot done as far as my work when I'm trying to teach them. Goodness gracious. And I swear I'm going to teach my kids Latin. I'm going to torture them, pay back for all this mess. But anyway, sometimes the loss of sense of security triggers grief. We may not feel safe. Here in this pandemic situation, many of us don't feel safe. We come to realize how insecure that we can be, that our health can be pretty quickly fleeting. We're not as well as we thought we could be. We were initially told that the at-risk groups, those are breathing issues, asthma, etc., diabetes, overweight, elderly, were in these target groups that were, more adversely affected. And that's true, but there have been people my age and younger who are very healthy who have been struck down by this disease, is COVID-19. Another just brainstorming type of loss that one can trigger grief in one person is the loss of sense of usefulness. Job lost his security, lost his routine, lost his identity probably with the changes in life, the loss of his children, his property, his wife, his health. And he probably lost a sense of usefulness. Especially when he lost his health, he didn't feel as useful, I'm sure, to other people as he had been. Not as spry as he once was. And many, especially in our church, in Dallas Baptist Church, who are older, have lost that sense of usefulness because of fleeting health. We can't do like we used to do. We can't run like we used to. We don't have the stamina we used to. We may not be able to participate like we used to. But look at all these different losses I've identified, talked about identity, routine, security, usefulness. A lot of those in our congregation have retired. And you've gone through probably a lot of these losses in retirement. Loss of identity, routine, security, usefulness. And many of us who are not retired but still working have had our world upended with this change in life through this pandemic, a loss of identity. A lot of times we identify ourselves by our job. And some have lost their jobs. A loss of routine. My routine was to get up in the morning, take the boys to school, drop them off, come to the office, go make visits. And my routine has been upended. Financial security is fleeting for many of us, especially those who have lost jobs. And I don't feel necessarily as useful as I used to, because I used to go out and visit people. And I'm not able to do that anymore because of the shutdowns and the safety protocols, especially visiting those in homes. But we find that Job and others in the Bible, whenever they grieve, the kind of the remedy in the Old Testament is to put on sackcloth and ashes. And that sackcloth and ashes is a sign of one grieving. And it's a visible sign for others to see. It's a ritual in some ways. It's showing other people that life is not functioning as it usually did. That people need time to heal and to grieve. And there was a ritual. In fact, we find over here in chapter 2, verses 11 and following, that Job's friends sat with him 7 days and nights. The Shiva, they sat Shiva with him. They sat with him 7 nights and grieved with him. Let me just read those verses. Verse 11 reads, "Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all the troubles that had come upon him, each of them sat out from his home: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort. When they saw him at a distance, or from a distance, they did not recognize him." And he'd gone through a lot, Job had. They didn't recognize him. "They raised their voices and they wept aloud. They tore their robes. They threw dust in the air upon their heads. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great." They grieved with Job. And we may not be going through the same type of grief that a friend, a relative, a neighbor may be going through, but we can still be with them and grieve with them. We may not put on sackcloth and ashes or scream and holler like that, but we can cry with them. We can be a shoulder for them to cry on. But one of the knee-jerk reactions that many of us have whenever someone is grieving a life change, or especially grief through death, is we want to say something. And in my experience personally, through the losses of my life, as well as being a minister, I've seen it as well. People want to say things like, "Well, heaven gained another angel," or your mother's gotten wings now, or your brother's singing in the heavenly choir. We want to say things that are comforting, but that many times don't do any good. And sometimes those words that we share are sometimes hurt, whether we mean them to or not, and whether we intend them to or not. Those that are grieving, they hurt. What's one best response that we could do? Just be with them. Be an unanxious presence, as one of my professors used to talk about. There's a scholar, Kubler-Ross, group of scholars put out this book talking about grief. And, there used to be a talk of a cycle of grief, or at least a pathway of grief. Grief isn't always linear. You go through one stage, I guess you could say stages of grief, and you don't always go through one stage and you're good, and you go on to the next stage and you're well when you get to the end. Grief is sometimes a big old ball, like a big old ball of yarn and knot, that we may go through one stage and we may go back to another stage and back and forth. There's stages like acceptance, or parts like acceptance, shock. We don't always grieve well, and we never really totally get over grief. We just renegotiate a new sense of identity, a new sense of a new normal. I hate that term. I'm hearing it a lot lately with the pandemic, but a new normal. But as we get there, as we get to that new normal, as we go through these grieving stages or parts, I guess you could say, what type of support do we need? Well, we need people around us loving on us, caring for us, maybe keeping their mouths quiet and just being there for us. And as we look at Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they sat with him 7 days, didn't say a thing. Just sat with him. They empathized with him, maybe. The big problem came in when they opened their mouths and they started saying things. And we find that the bulk of the book of Job is them saying the wrong things. They pretty much have a viewed or skewed theology of God that says that Job did something to have earned or have been to be punished by God for these by these events in his life, the loss of his property, his children, his wife, his health. Job must have done something. You know, life just happens sometimes, and we find in the book of Job the kind of the inside knowledge that we have is reading the book. Job didn't do anything; it just happened. Pardon my language, but sometimes life just sucks. Life just stinks. We have God and his Spirit to comfort us and be with us. And sometimes we need the more tangible notion of our friends and loved ones being with us. In this season of pandemic, we can't sometimes physically be with somebody like we'd like to be, but phone calls, just listening to them talk, being a listening ear. If you're able to video chats are good. Just listen. Card in the mail. But they didn't say anything initially, these friends. They empathized. You know, one thing about grief is a lot of us have been there, and if we put ourselves in or try to think about what our life would be like if we're going through the grief of the person that we know is experiencing currently, we put ourselves in their shoes, essentially. How would we want to be taken care of? And sometimes our initial gut reaction to say something, maybe to death or something, if we put ourselves in the other person's shoes, we may not want to hear that. So, an anxious presence, being there for somebody who's going through this grief process, and experiencing a new normal, or trying to get to a new normal. These are good things to keep in mind during the midst of this pandemic. Thank you.